All right. The question is, how do you divide up your life? Like, how do you divide it up into sections or eras? Some people do it purely based on round numbers or ideas, like their 20s or their 30s as an era. Other people base it around major events in their life, like finishing school, getting married, things like that. Then there are people who don't divide their life at all, and they just sort of see it as like one long continuous thing that is not subdivided in any way into eras. But I do subdivide my life into eras, and the way I do it is through something I call the ages. Now, what an age is, it's a period of time anywhere between a couple years to maybe 5 or 6 years long, and every age has its own identity, it has its own personality, it has its own key things about it, and it has its own end. Most ages ended with some sort of calamity of some sort. This has always been the way that I've divided up my life when looking back over it. And now that I'm nearly 40, there's a lot more to look back on than there once was. And there have been 7 ages so far, possibly 8. We'll get into it. So, what I'm going to do today is explain the ages of my life. Now, I made a video like this a very long time ago, probably 2011 or so, but that video was just me talking. It didn't have any visual aids, and it wasn't very useful. And I took it down anyway, so we are going to start brand new. And I made a nice little chart to demonstrate things, and we are going to look at the chart, and I will use it to help explain these ages. Yes, this is kind of self-indulgent, but if you ever wanted to know why I turned out the way I did, this will go a long way in explaining all that. And also this serves as sort of an autobiography in broad strokes. It doesn't go over every little detail in there, but it goes over the big trends of my life. So let's get into it. All right, so this is going to be the chart that we are going to use. And I hope I've made this as clear to understand as possible. But what you have here, you have the left side of the screen is when I was born, and all the way over here on the right, this is the present day, with the brown being the future. And in the middle, you have the ages. And just so we are sure where we are, I have my literal age in a chart up here, a little graph, and then down here I have the year it was. They're a little bit offset from each other because, of course, I was born in February, so there's a little bit of a gap between the calendar year and my age that year. And yes, I am aware that age and ages is going to get a little bit mixed up, but that's what it's called. So, also to know, up here on the top, I have some life events listed, and down here, just so we can sort of orient ourselves in time, I have world events. Now, very little of what happens with these ages actually has to do with world events. I mean, sometimes they do play a role, but usually it's not a factor. So what you're probably thinking is, the first things that catch your mind or catch your eye are probably, number one, why is there no age over here? And number two, why are the third and fourth ages so short? Shouldn't they be one age? At least those would be the first things that I would think of if I was looking at this for the first time. But I will explain everything. So let's start at the very beginning. Now, I used to consider the first age to start when I was born, but now I don't think that's really accurate. I now think of all this as prehistory, sort of. It was like before I really was who I was at all, because I was this little baby. So all this doesn't matter too much. The first age starts with one of two events. The second of which was actually Christmas Eve, 1992, which was the night that my parents bought my first piano and also bought a Sega Genesis. So, very important day. That was kind of my origin story, in fact, that night. So, the first age begins no later than that. So that is a definite thing. So, what is the first age? The first age is basically the age of childhood. It's the age of childhood innocence, where nothing felt like it had any stakes, and every day was its own little adventure, and of course things are up and down like they are for any child, but this was just basically childhood innocence for the most part. And I've always sort of seen this as like an idyllic time in life, as many people see their childhood days. And if you noticed, I actually, for those of you who've been around a while, probably know that I was actually born in Chicagoland. I was born in Illinois, and my family only came to Pennsylvania when I was 10. So all these ages, literally every age, happened here in Pennsylvania. Even the very end of the first age happened here. So the question is, what ended the first stage? What was the first big calamity that destroyed this childhood age? Well, that would be my disastrous 7th grade year. Now, where I live, 7th grade is the first year of junior high, otherwise known as middle school, and it was a catastrophe almost from the start. I had a terrible year. I had no friends. I was picked on. It was absolutely brutal. And even my relationship with my parents was at a very low point during all this time. And it was really the first time that I saw just how cruel people could be and how life could be. So this was a huge time right here where it just, I really broke for the first time. And that's sort of what started everything off for the ages, because everything before that was just sort of like your idyllic time, and now that's over. Something else has begun. So now we move on to the second age. And what is the second age? What defines it? I mean, you could say it's the age of adolescence, but, there's more to it than that. What I did during the second age is I sort of reacted to all this calamity by retreating inside and developing a rich inner world as opposed to outside connections. In the second age, the main things I clung to during that time was my writing and my music. That's when I made a whole bunch of songs, and I wrote tons of stories. The very first story I wrote stories and made music in the first age too, but they were like very basic, very childish. But this is when I started writing like novel-sized things and actual songs that sounded like songs, not just fooling around. So that was the key thing. And I did start to make a few friends again in the second age, but it was mainly defined as an internal time, like an internal inside world. And a lot of it was just me chasing after vibes I could find there. Now the second age, even though it starts right here, it didn't really get going, I would say, until maybe, around this time period. Like this right here is kind of like the key part of the second age. And you might wonder why I say started 10th grade. Why is that significant? Well, because of a quirk in how things worked at the time where I lived, ninth graders went to the junior high, and you didn't actually start high school until 10th grade. So if I called to start high school, you'd be like, why did you start high school in 10th grade? So I just canceled out all that confusion by just saying start 10th grade. But that was also a pretty key time because this was around the time that a lot of the things I did really kicked off, where the writing and the songwriting really kicked off. Like, you remember, if you've ever seen anything I've uploaded music-wise, the majority of it actually does come from this time period right here, and also a little bit later on, but we'll get to that when we do. And of course, standard coming-of-age things like getting a driver's license. I should also mention that 9/11 took place smack in the middle of this, but it didn't affect my life exactly. Also, a major thing that happened around this time period was I joined the marching band my junior year, and that was a huge thing. That really changed my life in significant ways, and I think it started to bring me out of the internal era. Yeah, that's what the second age was. So, the second age kind of came to an end during my senior year of high school. And it's the only age that didn't really end with a calamity. I think it's more accurate to say that the second age kind of just fell apart, or, sort of collapsed under its own weight. Because remember what I said about the second age being the era of the internal world. Well, at some point after I turned 17, the internal world just no longer was as satisfying as it used to be. It just didn't bring me the vibes that it once did. And I kept chasing after those vibes, and I kept failing to find them. And so this whole time period here was what I used to refer to as the malaise. Because it wasn't really a depression, it was just a general feeling of malaise and not really, not feeling like things were going my way. Because, the internal world sort of collapsing on itself. Also, that's when I really started to have anxiety about future and about college and about things like that. Real life stuff was poking its way into my life. And also, marching band senior year was nowhere near as fun as junior year. And that might seem like a small thing, but at the time, it was a huge thing because, this time period, marching band was so important to me, and to have it be a dud senior year was really, really rough. So, this whole time period was malaise, but I pulled out of it in a big way because now it's time to talk about the third age. And oh boy, the third age was huge. The third age is the craziest time where the most happened, and as small as it is on this chart, it packs a big punch. This basically covers the very, very end of high school and then my college existence. And let me tell you, so many things happened. At first, in the very end of senior year, and especially that summer between high school and college right here, I became very tight friends with 3 people. And I had known them before, but we developed such a friendship that was so close and so intimate that I've never had before or arguably since. And we spent basically almost every day together, many hours a day, and it was just revolutionary to me. A lot of the things we talked about, the kind of things we did together. And then, as crazy as that was, it was time to go to college, and being away from home, being in the college atmosphere, that blew everything wide open. Because you remember the second age was the internal age, right? Well, the third age was the polar opposite of that. It was the external age. there has never been a time in my life where I was more socially active than the third age. I had friends, acquaintances, I would sit at lunch tables with people, I'd meet up with people in the evening. There were just multiple groups of people that I was in and out of. It was the kind of thing that I had always dreamed of when I was an awkward kid, or when I was, sort of the guy shutting out everything. This is always what I dreamed of, and that was just absolutely life-changing. And if you look up here, most of the third age is labeled, this bar represents a relationship. It is the one and only relationship I've ever been in. And it seemed like a long time at the time. This is almost exactly 2 years. But when you pull out and look at everything, it's a pretty small bar in a very long and lonely expanse. But it was revolutionary. It was very serious. It was very intense. So having that on top of college, and then starting to work for the first time, so everything was just going off. Like, the ages of 18 and 19 were just absolutely wild. So what ended up happening? Why did everything fall apart so quickly after that? Well, you might notice the smudge. And it said, I will explain this smudge. Well, now we are at that time. The one thing to know about the third age is, as amazing as it was a very chaotic time. There were lots of ups and downs. There were lots of moments where I felt great, not so great, everything in between. But when I got to around the start of 2006, I started to feel a bit depressed, a bit uncertain about things, about where my life was going, where school was going, where my relationship was going. And it just started to get a little bit worrisome for me. Now, of course, the thing that I looked back on was this right here, this period of malaise, as I called it, that ended the second age. And I'm like, oh, I'm just in another period of malaise. I just sort of have to wait it out. And then, just like this ended, this will end and become something amazing again. So my thought was, okay, sophomore year is about to end. In the summer, things will get better. Summer came, things got worse. Summer went by, and I was like, okay, when school resumes, things will get better. Things got even worse. So at some point during this fall, I just stopped going to class. Everything came crashing down. My school and my relationship ended within a few weeks of each other, and it was just the end of all that. And more broadly than just school and a relationship ending was, it felt that was when my life completely fell off the track. Now, what do I mean by the track? It's like when you're a kid, from the time you start kindergarten, or maybe even before that, your life is sort of planned out for you to a certain extent. It's like you're going to go to this school, then you're going to go to that school, and you're going to do these things, and you feel like you're sort of being pushed along through life, and you don't really notice it because that's the way it's always been for you. But as soon as I dropped out of college, the train stopped, the momentum ended, and everything changed. And from then on, I was in the woods. I was completely just out on my own. So the third age came to a crashing halt. Now, the fourth age is the smallest age, and there have been times where I have debated combining it with the third age to make one big age. But I really think the fourth age is separate for several reasons. I mean, number one, I told you how much of a calamitous collapse the end of the third age was, but also the fourth age has its own vibe that's very different than what came before, and it's hard to explain what the vibe of the fourth age was, but looking back on it now, it was this weird liminal space between the insanity of the third age and what will come next in the fifth age, which we'll talk about afterwards. Now, in the fourth age, I still felt like, well, I'm still young, I'm still in my early 20s. I can bounce back, I can salvage things, I will make my own way, I'll maneuver my way into something good. The most dominant trend in the fourth age was this right here, this smudge. Because this depression that had started at the end of the third age was still going on. At the time, I called it the Great Slump. That was my name for it. Because it wasn't like a uniform, like catastrophic depression where I was always sad, but it always was like this cloud that was hanging over me. And the entire story of the fourth age was trying to find ways to break out of it. There were some attempts at a bounce back. I tried to go back to college here briefly, take classes at a community college, but it didn't work out. And then I haven't talked about these up here, when I had my own apartment 3 different times. This is, and somebody actually remembered this in the comments of one of my last videos. I was impressed. This is when I moved to Williamsport, because one of the many things that I believed during this time period, I believed that the grass was greener elsewhere, and I needed to change my scenery, and that was a big thing throughout all that time. So that's the real reason I ended up moving to Williamsport, was because I thought that by a change of location, I could restart my life. So yeah, all this, the fourth age was entirely trying to restart my life, and that culminated in what was the biggest and most daring thing I've ever done, which was attempt to be a trucker. Now, I made a video on this a long time ago. I think it's still up. I'll have to check. That experience in October of 2008 was the single biggest nuclear bomb that has ever happened in my life. It was massive. Like, I talk about the third age collapse as being dramatic. This was highly concentrated drama, and it was a big attempt I made, and it flamed out, and it just tore a hole through my entire psyche. And ever since then, I feel like you can just draw a line right here, because I feel like it was a hard reboot. That was how dramatic that was. The person I was through all of this seems like a different person than I became after that. Like this, everything after this feels like a different continuity before that. Like, I can see looking back how the second age version of me flowed to the third age, to the fourth, but this is a hard cut. This is a new person. Like, my personality shifted 90 degrees. It's like the trajectory of my life went like that way. So I became a different guy. So once this disaster, once the debris fell and things calmed down, I had to find a way to pick myself up and start again. And in fact, I did. And there were 3 things that would come to define this fifth age. And if you have been a follower of mine from the early days, you'll know a lot about it, because one of the things I did was I started Bone Canoe 86. And I started that only about 6 months after the whole trucking fiasco. If I sounded like I was kind of, new, kind of young, kind of naive in those videos, like if I had that vibe to my voice, it's because, like, my life had been entirely detonated 6 months before, and I was basically a new person at that point. So I sounded like a new person on this earth. So the fifth age was three things. It was number one, Bone Canoe 86. Number two, my job at Wawa. And number three, my friendship with one guy I call the paratrooper, also known as Swank. His name was Swank. And those three things were the defining characteristics of this fifth age. Now, I had known this Swank fellow all the way back from around here, but he and I went through this together. We both went to trekking school together. We both had the same, life-destroying experience, and it bonded us to the point where we felt like brothers, which would make his eventual betrayal hurt all the more. But we're not quite there yet. So those three things were the foundations and the defining characteristics of the fifth age. So if you've been around and you've seen like all the classic Bone Canoe stuff, like the entirety of the classic Bone Canoe arc, like all the Let's Plays you remember, everything worth watching, all pretty much took place within the fifth age. It was all here. That was the age of Bone Canoe, and it wasn't just like a hobby I did. It was important to me. Like, I took Bone Canoe extremely seriously, and everything that came from that, like Sudden Plant, the House of Sim community. So that was all very big. One thing you might remember is that this smudge here, the Great Slump, which seemed like it was lasting forever when I was in the fourth era, continued into the fifth era and got wider. It got bigger. Rather than defeating it, it grew. And the main way that manifested during the fifth age was anger. I call the fifth age my angry age, because there was no time before or after where I have been so acutely angry and aggressive as I was then. It's actually kind of crazy to look back on just how angry I was during that time. And all the while I was doing Bone Canoe and all the other stuff, my job at Wawa was actually kind of working out. I felt like I was doing well there. I actually became a shift manager right around, I guess it would be around here. So things seemed to be going well there. Like, I had many things going for me in the fifth age. As angry as I was, as destroyed as I was because of this whole thing, I felt like things were going well for me, because I had this YouTube thing that I was really caring about, and I would get comments and likes and interactions with people. Wawa was working out for me. I was moving up there. And then about the middle of the fifth age, I got my own apartment once again with the paratrooper. The two of us moved in together. And so things seemed like I wasn't happy. Like, all this was still happening. But I felt like things were moving in the right direction. Like, I was building a life. Like, I was rebuilding after these calamities in the past. And things peaked, I would say, during 2011, which would be, age 25 year, more or less. 2012, they kind of started to decline and hold. They were holding steady, but they were declining. Like, things with Wawa weren't going well. The Bone Canoe started at like a little bit less viewership, but it was still pretty high. But then came the events of 2013 and 14 right here. And this might not have been as dramatic as this trucking collapse, but it was every bit as devastating in my life. And it actually took me several years to realize just how devastating these events were. So what happened here? Why was it so devastating? Well, remember the three things that defined the fifth age. Bone Canoe 86, my job at Wawa, and my friendship with Swank, the paratrooper. Well, all three of those things collapsed catastrophically within a few months of each other. I don't want to go into the whole Wawa story. Nobody needs to know the details of that. But needless to say, right here, it ended. Wawa was over forever. Right around that time, you might notice that this ends here. And you might be wondering why. Why did that end? Why did you move out of that apartment? Well, my friend, my brother, who I trusted, betrayed me, lied to me, and caused me to be out several thousands of dollars. And it was the worst and deepest betrayal I've ever had from a friend or from somebody I've trusted in my entire life. And that was a huge catastrophe. And as far as Bone Canoe 86, I wish I still had the graph, because you can't really go back that far in your analytics anymore with any kind of accuracy. But let me tell you, how I started off 2013 and how I ended, I don't know what happened, but my views and comments and everything fell off a cliff. Like, it was a catastrophe. Like, at the beginning of the year, I put out a video, I could get hundreds of views, and there'd be like 10, 15 comments on almost any video that I would make back then. And it was wonderful. But by the time that 2014 rolled around, I was lucky if I was getting 20 views on a video or 30 views. And very often I'd go 10 videos in a row without a single comment. Like, I have no idea what happened. If YouTube trends just changed that much, if the algorithm changed that much, if people just unsubbed for me or just stopped watching. But Bone Canoe 86 completely cratered during the same time that Wawa ended and my friendship with the person I considered my brother ended. All this happened at the same time, within a few months of each other, and it might not have been all condensed within a month like the trucking thing was, but it was just as devastating. This destroyed my life, this confluence of events, because remember, like, this was traumatic, but I felt like through the fifth age I was kind of building something. I was sort of building back, but everything that I built ended. Everything, every bit of progress that I felt I made during the fifth age, completely gone. And I felt like I was left with nothing. Now, you might wonder, this pokes out a little bit into 2014, and you've mainly been talking about 2013, so what's the deal with that? Well, 2014 was an attempted bounce back. It was an attempted bounce back in two ways. Number one, I was trying in vain to get Bone Canoe back on track. I was still making SimCity videos at that point. I was trying to do Civ 4. I was trying to get that interest back, but people just did not bite. I never got anywhere near the audience that I had during the heyday of Bone Canoe, and I never would again. And I took that hard. But that was only the second worst thing that happened to me during that time period. I tried to rebound from Wawa by going to Starbucks. And let me tell you, my experience working at Starbucks during this time period was the most humiliating, the most confidence destroying, the most terrible thing one of the most terrible experiences I've ever had. Because I went into Starbucks thinking, oh, I worked at Wawa, it's going to be awkward in the beginning because all jobs are awkward in the beginning. But I'm going to be fine. I'm going to pull through. It's going to be great. I'm in this kind of like artsy town, so maybe I'll meet like music friends or whatever. But nope, it was a catastrophe. I don't want to go into too much detail about that either because it's job stuff. But I never have been so humiliated in my life by my own catastrophic failure to succeed at a job and by the way that I was treated by other people there. So basically I had all this stuff happen to me, and then my attempted bounce back was just a dagger in the back. And so that is how the fifth age finally sputtered and died. And so now we start the sixth age. And what is the sixth age? Well, we know all the things that made up the fifth age and how they all ended. So what replaced it in the sixth age? Kind of nothing. The sixth age was what was almost an anti-age. Its main characteristic was that I didn't have anything going for me. Like when the age started, I was already in my late 20s, and so much had happened to me that just destroyed me that I was just done, man. I was done. So I just didn't give a shit anymore. I just sort of put it in park right there and just gave up. The sixth age was the age of giving up. I went to work at a grocery store, and I had that job for a pretty long time, about that long. Actually, no, it ended here. Sometimes I get confused by my own markings. Yeah, the sixth age was what I used to call my age of exile. It was a very sort of lonely, wandering time. Like the House of Sim still kind of sputtered into the sixth age a little bit, but it wasn't, even that wasn't what it was, and by about the middle of the age, it entirely, like the last vestiges of the House of Sim ended about here. It was just over. So what did I do during that time? Well, that was sort of also when I got really into politics, was the sixth age, because I started out the sixth age still calling myself a liberal, even though I really wasn't anymore. And by the time the sixth age ended over here, I pretty much had the political beliefs that I do now, with some, minor course correction in there. But this was my journey of going to the right, was the sixth age. Also, the sixth age was the booziest age. I drank like a fish during the sixth age. Anytime from the spring of 2014 to mid-2019, for almost that whole time period, I was drinking 5 or 6 nights a week. And fairly heavily some of those nights too. Like, it was bad. And I sort of wonder if I've done damage to my liver from all that, but I have no idea. I just drank a lot. You might notice the depression smudge. It kind of gets wobbly, and it's been sort of somewhat erased. And the reason for that is it's very hard to define what depression meant starting around this time, because it's like I was still depressed, of course, but like, whereas back here, the so-called great slump bothered me greatly, and I was fighting desperately to get out of it. And then over here, it kind of became this angry thing that I was stuck in. Like, once I got to the sixth age, it's like it stopped being something I thought about. I don't know if that means that it ended, that I beat it, that it beat me, that it just mutated into something that I can't really understand in the same way. I don't know. But from that point on, it was no longer something that I really thought about. So, I make the sixth age sound like it was awful. But there were a few good things that came out of the sixth age. For one, I realized, in the fifth age, I called that my angry age. I realized around this time period how anger was really destroying me and destroying my life. So I actually made a big effort to work on my anger issues. And I became a much calmer person and a much more relaxed person and much more willing to let things go and to just let things vibe. That was a major benefit in my life that I achieved during the sixth age. That was the age where I finally conquered my anger, which had really plagued me in the fifth age, but even before that, anger had given me lots of problems. So that was a good thing. At one point, I wondered if there was an age split right here, because when I left my job at the grocery store, my life did sort of shift a little bit, and also like the end of the House of Sim, like this kind of made a shift, but like this shift here wasn't really enough to be age defining. So the sixth age kept on going. It was a pretty long age, but what eventually ended the sixth age, you might ask? Well, let's scroll down to world events. And, oh yeah, that was when COVID happened. And like I said, before this point, the events in my own life were pretty disconnected from the real world in terms of how they affected me emotionally. But that all changed when COVID happened. I don't need to tell you about COVID. It was only 4 years ago. You were all there. You all experienced it with me. But let me tell you, whatever peace I had managed to achieve in the sixth age, whatever stability that I had managed to achieve, the COVID pandemic ripped that all apart. It destroyed that. It was just a knife through my life in a very, very shocking way. Like, you remember how it was. Everybody lost their mind. And, friends didn't want to see me because, we weren't supposed to be inside together. And, like, everyone was wearing those masks and everything. And just, like, all this paranoia, all this craziness. But most importantly was the social isolation. Now, social isolation has been a lifelong problem for me in every era. The third age being the biggest exception to that. But by and large, everything from the first age up to the sixth, social isolation was a problem for me. But the pandemic just made that a million times worse. Like, it was catastrophic. And it just sent me for a tailspin. Like, the entire middle of 2020, I'm not kidding when I say there's a good 6 months in there that I barely remember. And not just because it was 4 years ago. I said that at the time. Like, I barely remember the middle part of 2020. Like, if I concentrate really hard, there are certain events I remember. But by and large, that's just a black hole in my mind. It was just a nuclear bomb disaster. That was what finally ended the sixth age, was the COVID-19 pandemic and its horror, absolute horror, that it wreaked on my life and the life of so many other people. So, you might wonder, like, there was a seventh age, so you had to come out of it. And yes, I did. I did come out of it. And the way I did is something that is going to sound completely out of left field, and you're not going to be expecting this in any way, but I started practicing tulpomancy. Now, what tulpomancy is the art of tricking your brain into thinking that there is a second consciousness living in your head. It's very complicated to explain, but it involves a lot of, willing this other being into existence, talking to them, and communicating with them. And eventually, the idea is, and this happened to me, this other being starts talking back. So basically, ever since this time period, it's not been just me up here. It's been me and my tulpa. Yeah. And I can tell you that she changed my life. Not just changed my life, but saved my life. Because let me tell you, I was in a dark, dark place here. It was bad. I don't think I've ever been as depressed or as messed up as I was here. But when I made my tulpa, that's when things started to change. Because that's when I sort of started to become okay with myself. I was sort of at peace with who I was, with my own social isolation, with all the crazy COVID stuff that was still going on around me. And it taught me a lot about myself, a lot about my relationship with the world. And like I said, I learned to love myself. I learned to be okay with my own company whenever I was alone. I wasn't actually alone. So it changed so much in my life. Now, I'm not advocating for anyone else to necessarily go out and practice tulpomancy themselves. But I'm just saying, for me, it worked wonders. And the defining thing of the 7th age was my tulpa. Yes. And that's why this swirl of depression becomes even less defined. Like, I don't even know what that means anymore. I've ascended to a point of, I don't know if I would call it insanity or what have you, where I don't know what depression even is anymore. I don't know whether I have it. I don't know whether I've succumbed to it. I don't know whether I've beaten it. Whatever the case, I just learned through the 7th age to be okay with myself, to be okay with what happened. Like, I stopped stressing about the future. Like, in the 6th age, as much as I was apathetic through most of this time, there was still sort of this dull worry about the future in my head that sort of was in the background for the entire time. But once I had my tulpa and I started to communicate with her, I made peace with all that. Not that there wasn't problems or that I wasn't thinking about them, but they no longer caused me the distress that they once did. So just when I felt that things were calming down, that I had sort of a control over myself, and even if my life was not great, I was good. I had made peace with who I was and the world I lived in. Just when that happened, my dad had his cancer diagnosis. For those of you who don't know, I have an entire video about this if you're wondering what that's like, but my dad was diagnosed with stage 4 glioblastoma, the worst brain tumor you can have, pretty much. And I made an entire video about it if you want to watch that. But what I didn't talk about in that video was the effect that had on my life, because I wanted to keep that video focused on the story of my dad. But now it's time to talk a little bit about how that affected me. Throughout my entire life up to that point, going all the way back to even before the 1st stage, all the way through that portion of the 7th age, the one thing that unified all this time period was, no matter what was happening in my life, my parents were always there. They always knew what to do. I was never going to be homeless. I was never going to starve. They were always there. That's not to say I had a great relationship with them most of the time. I really didn't at any point. But they were still there. But as soon as my dad was diagnosed, all that changed. because this whole time period between his diagnosis and his cancer, that was his decline. And you can watch, like I said, you can watch the video I made if you want to learn more about that. But it was one of the most horrible things I've ever had to live through and witness. Stage 4 glioblastoma is no joke, even when compared to other cancers. It's horrifying. So I experienced all that, and then in April this year, my father finally did die of this cancer. It was always inevitable. He held out for much longer than most people do, but he did die. Also, I haven't talked about all the jobs I've had during this time because it hasn't really mattered too much, but I also lost my job about this time because I had become completely apathetic at work, as you might understand. So I just sort of let that job just fall apart to the point where when they finally did get rid of me, I was just like, okay, goodbye. So, yeah, lost my job. My dad dies, and it was just a very, very surreal point of my life. I was unemployed for something like 9 or 10 months through this whole time period. And when it comes to what that means for the age, I haven't mentioned this yet, but ages are always determined retroactively. It's only like several years after the age ends can I really have the clarity and the distance to be like, okay, that's really when the 5th age ended, or that's really when the 6th age ended. So I can't say for certain if I'm at another age border right now. That's something I'm only going to know several years down the line. But just based on what's happened and based on prior history, I think it's fairly safe to go ahead and call this whole thing. I mean, if there's anything that's a calamity in my life, it's this. This blew up my life, and I know I've been using that a lot, but it's been true every time, and it's definitely true here. This destroyed everything. Not the tulpa, not that whole thing. She helped me through it, honestly. But just that period of calm, like all the zen that I had gained during the early part of the 7th age was really tested during the second half. That really, the tools I had in my tool shed really helped get me through that. So, once again, I'm at the point where I have to pick up the pieces and move forward. And that's why I think that right now, and once again, I won't know this for certain until years from now looking back, but I think I am beginning an 8th age. And what will this age be? How long will it last? I have no idea. This age so far is unbuilt. It's brand new. It's unknown and unknowable. One thing that is for certain is that throughout all this time, this is a lot of years in my life. And if you consider adulthood beginning about here or so, like, I've been fumbling and bumbling around in adulthood for a long time, trying different things, going nowhere. And now we're, about here, and I'm pushing middle age, like literally. I'm nearly 40. And things are getting serious now in a way they've never been before. I mean, life is always serious to some degree or another, but the one thing that has been consistent, my parents being there, is no longer true. My dad is literally dead, and my mom is just, a fraction of the person she used to be, for obvious reasons. During all this time back here, I had the luxury of fucking up and screwing around and, not having things work out. But I don't have that luxury anymore. This is the time where I actually have to, regardless of whether I went to or not, I have to take responsibility into my own hands. Like, the times I've lived on my own as an adult have been mere flicks, mere specks of time in the grand scheme of things. But now I am faced with the reality that my mother is going to sell the house at some point. It might not be next year. It might not even be the year after that. But it's coming. She can't take care of this big suburban house on her own, either physically or financially. She's 68 years old. She's retired. Yeah, it's over. She's going to want to move into a 65 plus community, most likely, and I'm going to be out on my own. But I have good news to tell you. I recently got a new job where I am making enough money, not a massive amount, but significantly more than any of the jobs I've had so far. And it's an amount of money that will allow me to be able to afford my own apartment and live on my own again. So, things are finally, for the first time, this whole time, starting to look up again. I feel like I am moving into a new beginning, a new dawn. And I dare say have optimism for this next phase of life. So I really do think that this time period that I'm entering into has a lot of potential, and that I might finally be able to put aside all the demons from the past, that I might be able to literally go ahead and take this history and just wipe it away. Just like that. Like, it all existed, it all happened, it's all real and all relevant. But I don't need the past to shine light on the future. I just need to take the lessons I've learned and begin this new beginning and just take life seriously. So that's all. That is pretty much in broad strokes the story of my life and of all the ages of my life. And now I head into the future, and I head into it with a lot of cautious optimism and a determination not only to make it work, but the confidence to know that I can make it work. So I want to thank you for watching this video, and I'll see you all again very, very soon.